Some many weeks ago, Jeanette La Russa Fenton called me and said, EJ, we need you to be our speaker, and I want you to concentrate. Can we hear me okay?
Can everybody hear him?
And can you hear me okay? And we're celebrating 85 years of Pearl Harbor. Could you focus your presentation on the Second World War? Then Rick Caldevilla called and said, EJ, you know that Memorial Day is coming up the Monday after the speech, so please talk about those that gave their lives to make America free and the democracy to survive. And then Mary Beth called and said, EJ, we're confirming that you're going to speak, but we'd like you to focus on something to do with Memorial Day and the veterans. I told Mary Beth, my father left me an extraordinary collection of World War II posters full of pictures, not just of the boys and girls from West Tampa that were serving, but the Tampa Tribune, the Tampa Times, La Gaceta, and other newspapers during the Second World War would publish pictures of different servicemen, men and women that were serving. My father was the head of the war bond effort for the Latinos in Hillsborough County, and he had these posters because he would display them in his department store windows, or urging people, mostly cigar workers, please invest in your country. We need you to lend the United States some money to pay for the war effort. Little by little, he went cutting so many photographs and putting them behind these posters that they became quite a rare and special collection. If you ever go to the Tampa Bay History Center, there's a big section on Sam Gibbons, but there you will see the Salcines War Bond Collection. And in answer to the invitation, I said, I'm going to bring my father's collection so that the West Tampa Chamber of Commerce can look at the great history. For instance, this one that I put here on the right was a special page that the Tampa Tribune published on the boys from West Tampa, the Boys Club of West Tampa. If you look, you're probably going to find your father, your uncle, your godfather, your neighbor, your friend, and many of you will see pictures that you say, that looks like my abuelo. That looks like my nano. And you'd be surprised that's exactly what they look like 85 years ago. So what I'm going to do today is open a time capsule. How did West Tampa find out about Pearl Harbor? December 7, 1941. It was a Sunday. People were out either at church or family luncheons. And of course, there's a big time difference between Hawaii and Tampa. So about 1:30, the Japanese Imperial Navy and Army started bombing and really destroyed the Pacific Fleet of the United States that was in Honolulu. Tampa was unaware of what was happening. But there was the famous Royal Theater, which is the old Centro Español on the corner of Cherry and Howard, where we dedicated the Tony Garcia street sign yesterday. That was the theater that we all went to. And in the middle of the movies, the projectionist stopped projecting the film. The lights went on, and Norman Kirkconnell, who was the manager of the Royal Theater, went on stage and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, it has just been announced that the Imperial Japanese forces have bombarded Pearl Harbor." Across the way in Ybor City, the famous Sunday matinees, the Sunday tea dances on the second floor of the Centro Español building on 7th Avenue, where Centro Ybor is today, everybody would go on Sunday late afternoon to dance because the famous Don Francisco Orchestra was playing. And all of a sudden, the music stopped. And Frank Grasso, Don Francisco, announced that the Japanese had just attacked Pearl Harbor. Everyone, of course, was shocked in Ybor City and West Tampa, and I guarantee you, everyone was shocked downtown. There was a couple that had just gotten married at noon at Sacred Heart. They had had a very brief reception, and the bride and groom had gotten in their car, and they were driving across, or hoping to drive across, Candy Bridge for a sweet honeymoon in St. Pete Beach. But back then, you had to go through a toll bridge. And when they stopped at the toll, the officer looked and he saw that the guy was in a uniform and says, "You can't go across. The war has just started. You've got to get back to your unit." And then the guard noticed that there was a sign on the automobile that said, "Just married." And the guard told the gentleman, "Take off your uniform and get to wherever you're going. I didn't see you, you didn't see me. Get going." Now, all of you remember as you were growing up that a famous commentator in sports, I think it was Channel 13, Salty Saul Flashman, was a young radio commentator, and he was with WDAE. Of course, we didn't have television, we just had radio, and very few radio stations in Florida. He was upstairs of the Tampa Terrace Hotel, directly across the street from where City Hall sits. He came down to the lunchroom of the Tampa Terrace Hotel to get a sandwich. Just as he is getting into the cafe, the general from MacDill, General Tinker, is getting ready to pay his bill. And he looks at the radio commentator who he knew because Tinker loved to fish, and Salty Saul always knew the good spots to get fish. And he said to the young man, "Any news that you're getting on your radio?" And Salty Saul innocently says, "Well, just as I was leaving, the teletype said that the Japanese were attacking in Pearl Harbor." "What?" The general almost choked and said, "Son, that means war." And war it was. So Not only did the United States go to war and Tampa and Hillsborough County go to war, but West Tampa went to war. Right across from me is Mrs. Villa, wife of Hector Villa. Her two brothers-in-law, who were older than Hector, her husband, immediately reacted, "We are going to get even with those Japanese for destroying and killing our Americans." And even though one of them was below the age, they tried to enlist the following morning, Monday morning, December the 8th. But one of them was rejected because he was too young. And the brothers had said, "We're going together. We're going to serve together." So they got on a bus, went to Orlando, lied about the age, and immediately enlisted into the U.S. Marine Corps. And it wasn't long after that they were in a transport ship and sent to the Pacific for some very bloody hand-to-hand combat in the different islands of the Pacific, fighting the Japanese, especially in Guadalcanal. The Villa brothers got so many medals, one of them probably should have received the Congressional Medal of Honor, but he was part of a minority, and that medal was reserved for the others. But they served their country so well that when all seven served in different branches in all the different wars, Hector was very active and convinced the city to dedicate the Villa Park. And I'm honored that Mrs. Villa is here with us today representing a family, one of many, that served diligently to keep America free. My father had a department store on the corner of Howard and Main. Some of you visit Salcines Park. That's where my mother and father had a department store for many years during the Second World War and Korea and even after. But across the street on Main Street, not on Howard, but on Main Street, there was a small office called the Western Union Office. And that office, unfortunately, was very active, because when your brothers and uncles were missing in action, the telegram would always come, and the boy on the bicycle would deliver the telegram that you did not want to receive. But especially when a telegram was being composed that the young man had been killed, the lady was reading the teletype before she would get that yellow paper and paste it together. She would holler across the street to my mother, who was the seamstress, "Juanita, Juanita." My mother would get up from her Singer sewing machine and walk to the door. "¿Qué pasa? What's wrong?" "Tell your husband to get word, because the Fernandez boy on Beach Street has been killed, and your husband knows where the nearest phone is. He knows what he has to do." There was a network that my father had. There were very few telephones in West Tampa. My father knew who owned the different telephones and where they lived. So whenever the boy was going to deliver a telegram saying, "We regret to tell you that your son has been killed," or that your son is missing in action, my father would quickly call the nearest house that had a phone and would alert them, "Hey, you're going to see the boy from the Western Union in his bicycle. He's going to deliver the terrible news to the Fernandez family there on Beach and Havana. Make sure that when you hear the scream, that the neighbors go over to console. So it was a network of family and neighbors helping each other, especially when their children were being killed or were missing in action. So today, I want you to focus that 85 years ago, this year, the United States went into a global war. It wasn't just against Japan. Japan had signed an agreement with the Axis power, Mussolini and Hitler, saying if they attack one of us, we'll all go to war together. So on the day after Pearl Harbor, it so happened by coincidence that Fort Homer Hesterly, across the street from where Villa Park is now located, had a ribbon cutting ceremony. That was part of our state militia. We now call it the National Guard. The ceremony went through, but everybody knew that it was now a very serious moment. And that evening, the Congress came together in a joint session, and the words of Franklin Delano Roosevelt have never been forgotten. A day that will live in infamy. And Franklin Roosevelt asked and got the declaration of war. You see that one of the posters is the declaration of war. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. And that night, Thursday night, the United States declared war against Hitler and Mussolini. So today, I ask you to remember the enormity of what happened 85 years ago, December the 7th, 1941. The historian of the University of South Florida, our friend Gary Mormino, says World War II was the single most important event in Tampa history. No one in this room remembers the details of December the 7th. Some, the older ones, might have a vague recollection, but everyone here remembers what happened on September 11, 2001, when the Twin Towers were hit. Well, you remember the monstrosity of all the people that were killed. Almost a similar, equal number of those that were killed in Pearl Harbor. But the Japanese didn't just invade and attack Hawaii. They went on and they attacked the Philippines, they attacked Guam, they attacked Wake Islands, they attacked Midway, really catching us from the blind side. But then they weren't satisfied with just attacking American territory. They attacked British territories like Singapore, Hong Kong, Thailand, Malaysia. The first Americans to die during World War II died at Pearl Harbor. But by the end of the war, think of this number. By the end of the war, 16 million American men and women who had served 400,000 of them had died. 250,000 Floridians volunteered, and 4,600 Floridians were killed during that Second World War. 3 of our Tampa soldiers and sailors happened to have been in Pearl Harbor, and 3 of our Tampa boys were killed. The next day, the Japanese invaded the Philippines, and there was a physician from Ybor City, Frank Adamo. We now call his street Adamo Drive. Frank Adamo was a physician with the American Army in the Philippines, and the Japanese took him as a prisoner. And Frank Adamo served 4 years as a prisoner of war before coming to Tampa. So, Tampa reacted, and for your information, where we are today, where this luncheon is taking place, this was one of the 3 big air bases. This was Drew Field, bigger than MacDill Field. And the smallest of the 3 is where the University of South Florida is now located. That was called Henderson Field. And if you've been to Mel's Hot Dogs anytime recently, you were in one of the barracks of Henderson Field. So, we remember with great gratitude and respect all of those that served our nation. MacDill Air Force Base was approximately 5,800 acres in the southern tip of our peninsula, named for Colonel Leslie MacDill. It was a base with 3 water sides because, of course, it's a peninsula. And it had more than 15,000 military personnel, producing thousands of pilots, gunners, and navigation. It had many runways and barracks. And we also had prisoners of war that have been captured and brought not just to MacDill, but to Drew Field, where we're having lunch today. Again, Drew Field was larger than MacDill. These 2 bases were so big and so important that they needed a highway to join both MacDill and Drew Field. And there was a dirt road called Vera, and the dirt road became Dale Mabry Highway. It is probably the best built highway in Hillsborough County because the cement is probably 6 to 8 inches in concrete and reinforced. Why? Because they were transporting motors, airplane motors, tanks, military supplies between both of these bases. That's how we've got Dale Mabry. Henderson Field was a smaller field. It opened up in May of 1943, and it so happens that this is the 83rd birthday of that Henderson Field being opened. It only lasted 2 years because after the Germans surrendered in May of 1945, they decided to decommission Henderson Field. And that was the land that Sam Gibbons said, We've got Henderson Field. That would be a very good location for our new university, the University of South Florida. Many of you that are here, your uncles, your abuelos, your fathers, your neighbors, all had to report to Camp Blanding, north of here between Stark and Jacksonville. Camp Blanding in Florida became the fourth largest city during World War II. It grew to up to 180,000 acres, and it housed more than 55,000 soldiers. Florida had dozens of military bases all over Florida, and so many people from other states came to sunny Florida, and after the war they said, we're going back to Florida. When I was born in 1938, since we're celebrating the 85th birthday of Pearl Harbor, Florida was the third least populated state of 48 states. Fast forward to today. Florida today is the third most populated state of 50 states. Much of that is due to World War II, because so many of our servicemen got their training and saw what Florida was like and what it had to offer, and they moved back and they raised their families here. West Tampa is full, like Ybor City and the rest of Tampa, is full of heroes of World War II. They are our greatest generation. I've already mentioned the Villa brothers, but we had Henry Capaz, related to a man that we all remembered selling devil crabs, Miranda. And then we had the principal of West Tampa Junior High, Braulio Alonso, who served in a most distinguished manner. He was there with General Patton in North Africa, and then they jumped over to Sicily, and then they jumped over into the mainland. And because he was bilingual, and the colonel that was his superior commander did not speak anything other than English, Braulio, of course, was his right-hand man. And they were on a jeep, the first jeep to enter Rome as the Germans were fleeing. And the colonel says to the driver, "Take me to the Vatican." So they go to the Vatican. And the colonel says, "That Swiss guard over there, go over there." And he turns to Braulio and says, "Tell him that I want to see the Pope." And Braulio, being a devout Catholic, says, "You know, Colonel, with all due respect, you just don't show up in the Vatican and say, 'I want to see the Pope.' You have to make an appointment. That's called an audience." "Well, what the hell, we're here. Tell the guard that I want to see the Pope." The guard understood Braulio's Spanish and said, "Wait here." He brought back one of his superiors. The superior asked, "Do you have an audience?" "No." "And you want to see the Pope?" "Yes, we want to see the Pope. We're the first Americans in the Vatican." The officer says, "Wait." He comes back and he says, "The Pope will see you, but you have to take off all of your weapons." So they took off their 45s and their carbines and their M1s and machine guns and left it in the Jeep. And of course, Braulio is the one that is the spokesman for the Americans. And Braulio said, as the door opened in this beautiful room, Pope Pius XII came out, and he was so skinny, he looked like skin and bone. But the Pope was very courteous to us and gave us each a rosary. And Braulio told me, EJ, the last words of Pope Pius XII were these. I've got them embedded here. Braulio, what did he say? He said, you are the victors now. Be compassionate. Of course, they went all the way to Berlin, and the Second World War ended. But we had people like Felipe Rossetti, whose family owned a restaurant directly across the street from Salcines Park. He was there in D-Day. Joe Navarra, who was one of my assistant state attorneys, was a young Italian boy that was also in the D-Day invasion. And when he heard that I was taking my wife to Normandy to see that very historic place, these were Joe Navarro's words. EJ, the beautiful beach that you're going to see in Normandy is not the Normandy that I remember. I remember the D-Day invasion in Normandy as the Red Sea. There were so many arms and legs and people dying that the water of that beach was red. Quite a description. And then you had the Jimmy Fernandez and Eustacio, the professor from the University of Tampa. His brother Jimmy was a navigator and was shot down somewhere in the Czechoslovakia, Austria area, and was taken prisoner and spent some years in a German prisoner of war, a stalag as they called them. And then as the Russians and the Americans were invading Germany, the Nazi officers there in that concentration camp took off, and so did Fernandez from Beach Street in West Tampa. He stole a German motorcycle, and he said, EJ, I kept driving and I kept driving going west because I knew that if I could get to the Pyrenees Mountains, I could convince the Spaniards that my father was from Asturias. And that's what he did. They quickly identified him. You're an American, but how come you speak so good Castilian? And he said, my parents were from Asturias. He said, they took care of me like if I was one of their family, and I finally got to Asturias just as the Second World War was coming to an end. And then we have Homer Hesterly, for whom our National Guard building is named, and the famous Tony Pizzo, and Al Charamonte, who served so many years on our school board. And of course, Tony Garcia, that we recognized yesterday, served in the Aleutian Islands there in Alaska, as well as in Panama. And then we had Jose Ural, who had the Sherman Williams paint store in Ybor City. He was the son of Spaniards. He spoke Spanish so well that they said, we want you to be a counter spy. And they put him in a submarine and took him to the area of Galicia in northwest Spain. And Jose Ural arrived at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning into a beach in northwest Spain with his little transmitter so that he would watch any movement of German submarines and German planes and German ships. And at a particular hour, he would start in his Morse code, informing where those enemy armaments were at. And then on Cherry Street, we had the 4 Valdez boys across the street from my home. My home, the back door of my home was the Villa home, but across the street from my front door was the Valdez boys. 4 of them served. And our next door neighbor was Larry Rutigliano. Many of you have pictures of your parents' weddings and graduations and first communions by Larry's sister Rose, who took the pictures of so many of West Tampa and Ybor City. And of course, Sam Gibbons and Arsenio Sanchez from McFarland Park, and Tony Cardinale, who I brought a special review on that table. And then we had Roland Montega from the La Gaceta newspaper, and Venancio Arduengo and his cousin Luciano Prida, whose son, Luciano Prida Jr., is still one of our West Tampa CPAs. So many others that I could mention, including my priest from St. Joseph Church, Father Henry Simons. All of these people served in a most distinguished manner. We have much to be grateful for. We live in a democracy and we live free. We're not speaking Japanese and we're not speaking German, because they gave the ultimate price to keeping our country free. So Monday, remember, Memorial Day, that's not a joyous day. No, it's not a joyous day. It's a day that we have to pray and say, thank you, Lord, because they gave their lives for our country. And then Veterans Day is coming up, where we celebrate all those that have served. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation. Certainly you're leaving more informed about what our community was 85 years ago. God bless our country, and God bless each and every one of you. Thank you.